have Dr. David Burns, retired Forest Service, and we have Caleb Zerstadt, and he's currently working for the Forest Service and Fisheries. And then Fisheries. I'm going to turn this light off so we can see. And this light off so we can shine everybody's lights. And this it's a glare.
Oh,
there we go.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Okay. So as Terry said, my name is Caleb Zerstadt, and I work for the Forest Service as a fisheries biologist. And you may have had some presentations from folks with Idaho Fish and Game, biologists with Idaho Fish and Game, but the difference between a biologist for Fish and Game and the Forest Service is that the Forest Service is responsible for managing the land, national forest, whereas Fish and Game manages the critters, basically. Sets bag limits for fish, or that does the hunting regulations. And usually a lot of times when I tell someone I'm a fisheries biologist, they ask if I work at the hatchery, and I don't. That's Fish and Game. So I'm going to talk about mostly about the salmonids of the Payette National Forest, but not just the salmonids. This presentation has kind of evolved a little bit through time, and so I'll talk about some of the other fish that you might find in the streams and lakes around here. And it's going to be focus on some on their biology and then on habitat. So I'll talk about the life cycle, spawning and rearing, the habitat they use over that life cycle, and then seasonal habitat use, and then a little bit about natural and human disturbance. And these guys here, for example, are not salmonids. Salmonids is the kind of a common name for the Salmonidae family, which are the salmon and trout. It also includes whitefish and grayling, which are subfamilies within the Salmonidae family. So these are actually sculpin. Okay, so I'll just give you a kind of an introduction to some of the fish we have around here before I go in more into detail on their life cycle, and feel free to ask questions anytime as we go along. So these are Chinook salmon, and I'm going to talk a little bit initially about these different fish and their life history, just kind of real generally before we get into specifics. So Chinook salmon are typically what we call anadromous, meaning they will spawn in fresh water, the juveniles will rear in fresh water, and then they go out to the ocean, migrate out to the ocean, spend some time in the ocean, and then come back into fresh water to spawn. And the Chinook that are around here will usually spend about a year and a half as juveniles in fresh water before they go out to the ocean. Then they'll spend 2 or 3 years in the ocean typically before they come back to spawn. So this is a juvenile, young of the year Chinook salmon, and then these are the adults that came back to spawn. This is the Latin name, Oncorhynchus. There's a lot of different ways people pronounce this. It turns out that most of the Latin names for the salmon and for rainbow trout all originally came from the native people of Kamchatka. So it was originally sort of a Russian word, but then it's been translated from German to Russian to French and then to English, and then it was kind of Latinized. So some people say shawisha, but then sockeye salmon. So you've probably heard the term kokanee and sockeye salmon. The sockeye salmon that are kind of famous for Redfish Lake. Well, they're the same species, but kokanee is a landlocked sockeye salmon. So we have kokanee in Payette Lake here, they're probably now all basically just introduced kokanee, but historically we had a run of sockeye salmon that were anadromous that went to the ocean and came back to Payette Lake. And there were enough at one time that there were commercial fisheries for the sockeye on Payette Lake. And there was one account of a commercial venture putting up 75,000 fish in 1 year. And that all ended in about 1924, I think it was, that Black Canyon Dam was put in on the Payette. So that blocked any upstream migration. And then there was a series of additional dams in that system. Now this is a kokanee that comes from Loon Lake. And as far as we can tell from the genetics, it doesn't appear to be related to kokanee in this area, so it's likely endemic. So this could be a relic from when there were sockeye. And then red band trout. So this can be kind of confusing. A lot of times fish biologists anyway will refer to the native rainbow trout of this area as red band trout. It's just a subspecies or form of rainbow trout that's native to the upper Columbia River Basin. And so there's sort of a resident red band trout, and then there's the anadromous steelhead, and I'll show you a picture of some steelhead. But so with salmon, talked about with Chinook salmon how they would spawn in fresh water, spend about 1.5 years, go out to the ocean, spend a couple years, and come back. There are some Chinook salmon that, just like the kokanee that I said are landlocked. There are Chinook salmon that they put in reservoirs and large lakes, and they live their whole life history in fresh water, so they can kind of do both. Well, red band trout, rainbow trout are no different in that you have some fish that are resident in rivers and lakes. This fish is from the Weiser River system. This fish is from the North Fork of the Payette River. These are more resident to fresh water anyway. And then you have the anadromous form that swims out to the ocean like a salmon would. And steelhead are a little bit, or rainbow trout in general, are a little bit harder to, they have even more kind of variability in their life history. So it's not as clear cut how long they'll spend in fresh water and how long they'll spend in the ocean. And they can also spawn more than once, whereas the salmon always just dies. So their berry term is kind of sort of plastic, where they there's a lot of diversity in their life history. So, but typically a juvenile steelhead could spend up to 3 years in fresh water, and then they'd go out to the ocean and spend a couple years, 1 or 2 years in the ocean, and then come back. So this is a juvenile, likely fish that's about to smolt and go out to the ocean, that was caught up by Bergdorf in one of the researchers' traps. And then this is a steelhead from the Salmon River. And then we have hatchery rainbow trout, which are real commonly planted by Fish and Game in lakes and rivers around here, and really around all over the United States and all over the world. There's a really interesting book by a guy named Anders Halverson about rainbow trout and how they've been spread all over the world. They've been introduced to every continent except for Antarctica. And there's a good chance now, because most of the hatchery, the original hatchery rainbows came from one river, the McCloud River in Northern California, and then they were spread all over the United States. And there's a good chance now, no matter where you are in the world, if you catch a rainbow trout or find a hatchery rainbow trout, that it's related to those McCloud River fish. Not always. The fish now that Fish and Game, for example, plants in lakes around here are often kind of derived from red band, different types of red band, like the Kamloops red band. Or West Slope cutthroat trout, it's our state fish. They are not anadromous, but they do migrate long distances. And this is an adult, and this is a little juvenile about 3 inches long. We did a project on migration of west-slope cutthroat trout in the middle fork of the Salmon River, and some of the fish migrated 200 miles in 1 year downstream for the winter and then back upstream to spawn. So they can move a lot, or they can be resident and not move, you know, outside of a small segment of stream. Mountain whitefish, they look a lot different than all the other trout and salmon. One of the reasons they're in the Salmonidae family is they have I don't know if you can really see it, but they have the adipose fin, the little fleshy fin that oftentimes will get clipped off for hatchery fish, for hatchery salmon and steelhead. Bull trout. So bull trout are they're in the same family as salmon and trout. They're considered a char. So they have a different genus, Salvelinus, but they're considered a char with lake trout and brook trout. Bull trout also have pretty diverse life history. Some of them are resident, some of them are more, it's called fluvial, meaning they move back and forth in big rivers, and some of them use lakes like Loon Lake, or there's a lake up at Stibnite people call the Yellow Pine Pit or the Glory Hole, and they'll use that as a lake to overwinter, so they can use a lot of different types of habitat. This is a big fish that got big from being in a lake and eating lots of other fish. But in streams, small streams where they're resident, they may not ever get bigger than 6 or 8 inches. Eastern brook trout. So they're really widespread on this forest, and they're all introduced from back east. And they're in the same genus as bull trout. One of the issues with brook trout is that they can hybridize with bull trout, and they overlap somewhat in as far as habitat that they use. So we have some cases where at one time, I guess the North Fork of Lake Fork Creek is a good example. At one time there were bull trout, but when you sample in there anymore, all you find is brook trout. So there's cases where you had bull trout and then eventually it just becomes brook trout. Pacific lamprey is one that doesn't get a lot of notoriety. They're not in the Salmonid family. They're sort of like an eel, but they're parasitic. So they're anadromous. So an adult lamprey spends about 3.5 years or so in the ocean, and during that time it's parasitic, but it'll attach to other fish. And then they migrate back up rivers, and then they'll spawn in these freshwater rivers. And then the juveniles, that are the larvae that are called amocetes, just live in these sandbars, and they feed on the detritus and just kind of organic material for that period of time, and then eventually they metamorphosize and then migrate back out to the ocean. And they are, or were probably historically very important, just like salmon were very important to the ecosystem as far as bringing in nutrients. They even have a higher fat content than salmon, so they were probably, if insufficient numbers, a really important part of the ecosystems where they were present. They don't seem to be doing very well in the rivers on the Payette anymore. We don't have a lot of good information on how many there were historically, but recent surveys by Fish and Game, they find very, very few, and that the problem is they have a lot of difficulty getting through the fish ladders, and so there's just not many left. So, and then just because we live right here by Payette Lake, just kind of a list of some of the native and non-native species you might find in the lake here. Native species include whitefish, northern pike minnow, sculpin, red-side shiner, large-scale sucker, and the red band trout. Non-native species could be if there were some hatchery rainbow trout that were from the coastal form, kokanee, brook trout, perch, lake trout, and then west slope cutthroat trout are not native to the Payette River system. So any west slope cutthroat trout or other cutthroat trout that would be in the lake are non-native. Okay, so it kind of just gave you an introduction to those different types of fish we have, and generally talked about their life history strategy. I guess one important kind of take-home point of all that is that there's a lot of diversity in their life history strategies, and each one of them, you know, between the different species, there's a lot of diversity. Some of them go to the ocean, some of them don't. But then even there's a lot of diversity within species and then across the different species. So they can take advantage of a lot of different situations. You take a Chinook salmon, you plunk it in a reservoir, and it can still try and spawn and things like that. So now just sort of some specifics on their life cycle. For salmonids anyway, they have the different salmonids spawn at different times of the year. So spring, you could expect to see red band trout or steelhead spawning, and west slope cutthroat trout. Summer, so August, September, that's when the Chinook salmon spawn. And then fall, you have bull trout, kokanee, mountain whitefish, eastern brook trout. So there's some segregation in the periods of time when they're spawning. These are large bull trout. This picture isn't from the Payette, but these are some large migratory bull trout. Digging a red, which is where the eggs are deposited. The female deposits the eggs. This is a Chinook salmon red, and these can be quite large for a large fish like a Chinook salmon. Might be 10 feet across or so. And basically the female just turns on her side and uses the current from her tail to sweep away rocks and sort rocks. And what she's eventually getting is creating this pocket where there's larger gravels that she can deposit the eggs, and she's getting this fine material, cleaning that out of that pocket as much as possible. And she'll deposit the eggs in there, and simultaneously they'll be fertilized by the male. So the eggs are down there in the gravel. Takes 2 or 3 months for those eggs to hatch, depending on the water temperature. Really dependent on water temperature. It's warmer, they'll hatch quicker. Cooler, it takes longer. And once they hatch, they are called alevins or sac fry. So they basically have a big yolk sac attached to them, and they remain down in the gravel, just feeding, getting nutrients off of that yolk sac for say 4 to 6 weeks, again depending on temperature. So these little guys are down here in this gravel where they're protected from predators, and then eventually that yolk sac gets absorbed, and then they do what's called swim up, which is emerge out of the gravel, and they actually have to go to the surface and grab a little gulp of air so that they can fill their swim bladder for the first time and regulate their buoyancy. Here's an example of a little fry. And then the next life stage after fry for salmonids is often called the par stage, and it's called that because they have these par marks, these big oval splotches. This is a west slope cutthroat trout, a par for a west slope cutthroat trout. And then I talked a little bit about that you have these migratory and resident forms, different kind of strategies. So salmonid.
Quick question. So out of all what percentage of out of the eggs that are first laid